be talking about sustainable private forest management and fair taxation in Ontario. The impetus for this study came after going through the archive at Haliburton Forest this summer, where I found some really interesting documents and exchanges between Peter Schleifenbaum, the former manager and owner of Haliburton Forest, and others. So the question of how strongly policy and taxes influences how and why privately owned forest properties should be managed emerged. So we'll go through a brief historical context, some research questions that arose for tax programs, and then we'll use Haliburton Forest actually as a case study during the time of at least 3 of the programs and Peter's influence in the events that took place. And then we'll look at some other tax programs in other countries, followed by looking at some recommendations I have for incentivizing successful sustainable forest management on private lands. So Indigenous people first arrived onto the glacier-free land and began changing and clearing forests for their hunter-gatherer activities and agriculture. When Europeans arrived, natural resources like wood were already a large part of their lives and commerce. And after Britain took over the North American colonies, forests began disappearing rapidly, and foresters and concerned members of the public began to see the need for better forest management practices. So the government caught on to this issue, but initially only focused on the northern half of the province and the Crown lands. And this prompted local action for southern rural properties that needed assistance. This spurred the government into action and eventually legislation and tax programs. And this is where my story begins. So my objective was to answer the following 4 questions. Do taxation and tax incentives help achieve sustainable forest management for private landowners in Ontario? Are government programs sufficient for promoting sustainable forest management on private lands? What tax programs for private forest landowners were and are currently used in Ontario? And how do programs in other countries compare to the current managed forest tax incentive program that we have? So we'll go over the socio-political environment during the times of these 4 programs. As they were implemented, the drivers for their creation, and their objectives in terms of what was expected from responsible parties, as well as the critical issues that led to the outcomes of the program, as well as any changes or cancellations. So during the mid-20th century, the government was conservative and was very business-oriented. They also did not intervene in business if it was going well. During this time also, there was an economic boom in the province following the Second World War, but foresters were growing increasingly concerned for the lack of programs for southern rural properties. The Ontario Forestry Association wanted to support private landowners get recognition for the importance of their properties, as well as access to resources to help them manage it. So at first they created the Private Woodlands Program in 1949, at first as a certification system for tree farmers, but the conversation grew to include all private forested lands, and the program assisted landowners with tree planting and management. Later on, a pilot project was developed by the Department of Lands and Forests and then placed into legislation as the Woodlands Improvement Act in 1966. It also assisted landowners with tree planting and management, which was done by government members, and it provided advisory services. However, this act did not actually address the issue of taxation, where at the time, private lands were all considered developable, and therefore any property was rated as residential rate, and therefore many owners were actually taxed quite high, even if they weren't planning on developing it. Furthermore, when this program was canceled in the 1993, there was a break in responsibility from the government, and therefore no services were provided or advisory alternatives for landowners. So in the 70s, the government was still conservative and continued to be focused on business. However, this conflicted increasingly with public interest for environmentalism. And there was still this sort of issue of tax inequality between privately owned forested lands and farmlands. And so the government created the Managed Forest Tax Rebate Program in 1975 in order to give a 100% rebate on property taxes for participating landowners. The program also continued to provide advisory services, but it gave more responsibility to landowners over how they wanted to manage their lands. Then in the 90s, when the NDP took over, they took a very strong environmental stance and forwarded many environmental policies. However, large provincial debts led to some budget cuts. And unfortunately, some environmental programs like this rebate and the WIA suffered as a result. So although this program did not actually resolve the tax inequality, once it was canceled in 1993, there were no advisory services or financial assistance provided to landowners. Furthermore, this happened quite suddenly and with no alternative forms of assistance. So in the year previous to it being canceled, it was actually updated to have more stringent and therefore more costly expectations and requirements in order to join the program. And therefore, those that continued to want to participate in the program ended up with an increased financial burden after it was canceled. Then in the latter half of the 90s, the Liberal government took over and the economic situation for Ontario at this time was beginning to improve. However, there was still a large provincial debt that they needed to address. Doing so, they slashed a lot of social programs, and during their campaigning, they actually promised landowners that they would fill the gap left by the MFTR, and they would also address this tax inequality officially. So they created a new tax assessment category for managed forests on par with farmland. And in fact, the program, which is the Managed Forest Tax Incentive Program of 1997, reduced property tax by 75% for participating landowners. It also continued to provide advisory services for them and give responsibility to the landowners while reducing the red tape in order to join the program. So the requirements weren't as stringent as previously. Furthermore, it was going to be delivered partially through the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation, which would assess the value of properties. However, they updated their assessment category and created a system of assessment that basically nullified the objectives of the program and in fact increased the tax burden for private landowners. This was done without the consultation of the public or without the support of the MNR and the OFA, who had in fact helped to create the program and made the program. So in order to give some context to the changes to these tax programs, we'll take a look at Haliburton Forest. And while I was at Haliburton Forest, I digitized boxes upon boxes of documents. And from their archive, I found several folders that focused on the MFTRP as well as the MFTIP timelines and events. Some of the documents included written correspondences between Peter Schleifenbaum, the premiers at the time, the ministers at the time, as well as other forestry organizations. There was also newspaper clippings and articles, and Haliburton Forest Owners Association meetings, notes, minutes, and newsletters that I could look at. So using these documents, I created this timeline of events that followed the cancellation of the MFTRP, then the creation and initial implementation of the MFTIP program. I also got to note how Peter Schleifenbaum helped positively direct changes for tax programs in support of landowners across the province. So Haliburton Forest came under the ownership of the Schleifenbaum family in 1964, at which point accounts of the forest state say that it was riddled with diseased, deformed, and practically worthless trees, not even good enough for firewood in some cases. However, it continued to be used for timber, recreation, and hunting, as it had been done for many years prior to that, but with the goal of improving the forest state. So when Peter began managing it in 1971, he committed 15,000 hectares to the WIA program in part of those efforts in 1978, as well as participating in the Managed Forest Tax Rebate program. And that's why he struggled to kind of understand why it was canceled in 1993. He cited long-term economic and ecological consequences to Howard Hampton, the Minister of Natural Resources at the time, if this program was not immediately reinstated. As well, the financial burden placed on landowners left many of them feeling angry or like there weren't many reasons to hold on to their forests or their properties at all. So in an effort to get the province to take responsibility for the undue costs left for landowners to bear, Peter and the HFOA filed a complaint with Ombudsman, a non-political advisory group. So this group launched an investigation officially after getting documentation from Peter and the HFOA related to the cancellation of the MFTRP. Ombudsman found their complaint reasonable, but concluded that the WI agreements in the HFOA cases were not actually breached and had nothing to do with the MFTR cancellation. However, looking at the evidence, it seemed to show that the government did in fact drop its responsibilities without much warning or alternative. Furthermore, after assessing the cancellation of the MFTRP, both the Forest Policy Panel and the Fair Tax Commission stated in 1994 reports that reinstating the MFTR would be a reasonable temporary measure until a fair assessment of managed forests was created. To further their cause, the HFOA also organized some trail closures in 1994 and 2003 to challenge the current government and how it was addressing these issues. In both cases, the HFOA announced that it would close trails crossing both private properties to the public in order to gain their attention to the issue, as well as gaining sympathy regarding the financial barriers of private forest management under the current lack of tax programs. This is especially true since the public benefited both directly and indirectly from the forest services provided, or ecosystem services provided by these forests. The first organized challenge was set in November of '94, and it came with a threat to both close trails as well as clear portions or entire sections of forest on properties. And so a meeting was set between the private landowners, the MNR, and affected groups like the Snowmobilers Club. And unfortunately, that meeting held no results to a resolution. And furthermore, the MNR postponed its investigation of the MFTRP cancellation, and the program sort of alternative that they provided was a total bust. During the second challenge of December of 2003, the response was much faster on behalf of everyone, and MPAC was actually investigated by the MNR and the Ministry of Finances, and they found some very concerning findings. So while MPAC had reported property assessments increased by only about 8%, in reality it was closer to 44%. This means that some people were paying over $100,000 in property taxes for their properties per year. It's quite a bit. So a resolution was eventually reached regarding MPAC's assessment of these properties and its effect on MFTIP participation after pressure was put on by Peter, other landowners, and the OFA. While acreage had been previously valued more at the residential rate and forest less, in 2004, they changed that to value forest more accurately, as well as eliminating the band method for waterfront properties, which meant that some waterfront properties that were developable would be assessed at the residential rate, even though some were not able to be developed due to conservation concerns near water bodies. So jumping into other tax incentive programs, different from Ontario and the US, Europe's forests are mostly privately owned. Each country or state has a tax program that focuses on ecosystem services, with timber and fiber predominantly mentioned in both. Regarding the US, authors concluded taxes heavily influence forest use and management, but may not be the best tool for its encouragement. However, it's the most favored because of its easier application and cost. In Europe, private landowners view forests as multifunctional, and maintenance involves and management involves the maintenance for future generations. This attitude is very much reflected in Peter's management of Haliburton Forest in the past, as well as Malcolm's management of it currently. Additionally, most landowners are not actually interested in the economic values of forests, differing from many foresters, especially in Western Europe. These differences in values and beliefs between landowners and foresters of how and why forests should be managed has led to a misalignment of policy objectives and landowner objectives. In both Europe and the US, there is also a lack of national or cross-national cooperation that researchers have voiced would benefit land connectivity and therefore potential conservation efforts. So how do we continue improving sustainable forest management and create incentives for participation in these sort of tax programs? Where there are no other policy tools or other financial assistance, tax incentive programs are helpful to landowners who want to implement sustainable forest management. Furthermore, tax programs can be a gateway to landowners with little to no knowledge or experience of forests and their management. As I was talking with Peter and with other foresters at Haliburton Forest, it became obvious to me that sustainable forest management was encompassed in both actions and a mentality. Talking to Peter, he said that owners have to be environmentally minded and understand that forest management goes beyond an owner's simple tenureship of the property. In order for sustainable forest management under tax incentive programs to succeed, I believe programs need clear, concise guidelines that address ecosystem service maintenance, but needs to be straightforward enough to not create red tape for those that want to participate. As well, a lack of clarity on leadership direction, as well as other factors, can create misunderstandings, different expectations, and can cause failures of programs to address the concerns of landowners who benefit from these programs. Finally, communication between all relevant parties is needed to create, implement, and adjust programs to meet the needs of those landowners, as well as governments and conservation authorities who may indirectly benefit. More outreach is also, I think, needed to landowners to let them know about the benefits of joining these programs and managing their properties, especially near conservation areas. With that comes a caveat though. Very prescriptive and restrictive programs such as the Conservation Lands Tax Incentive Program can deter voluntary participation in the program, and therefore the adaptability is sort of the success behind the MFTIP program, which we currently still have in Ontario today. So with this, I'd like to say thank you, and I would like to quickly acknowledge and recognize Malcolm for taking me through Haliburton Forest, letting me go through the archives and bug the foresters about various questions I had. Mark Kuhlberg, who came up with the idea for this project and guided me through the initial phase of it, as well as my two supervisors here at U of T, Ben Kuttner and Sally Krigstin, there you are, for supporting me during this final phase. I also want to shout out to my parents who are watching on Zoom and some of my friends, as well as my cohorts who have made this a very wonderful experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanda. Mark is on the line, and I think he has some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Sanda. That was great. And just trying to digest it all. It's a lot to take in. Couple couple of things come to mind in terms of this. You just mentioned at the tail end of it, this fine line between red tape being an obstacle to effective management and actually having effective regulations. I mean, some people can see any regulation as being onerous and other people don't see it in that light. I mean, how would you try to define that fine line between those two issues, between being burdensome and being effective in terms of regulations?
I think it really comes down to education and educating forester or landowners about the kind of things that they can benefit from by participating in these programs. I know in one of my classes with Ben Kuttner, he talks about, it's a matter of letting landowners know about these programs and the benefits that can come with managing their properties with, the future in mind. And so I think it really comes down to having resources that maybe landowners can access, like, the website for MFTIP, where they can find out, it might feel restrictive, but really it's just a matter of kind of understanding that it is fairly flexible. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, well, and it's a difficult issue, right? I think that's the $64,000 question always in these instances. So let's say, for example, somebody who has a private forest says, I don't want to manage for timber values. I just want this to, I don't know, I'll bequeath this to society, to the Ontario government, or to the Nature Conservancy of Canada. I'm going to give them this acreage. And this is happening in the news all the time. Mm-hmm. So how do you put a value on the tax in terms of a taxation system? Should that type of a land have the same value as somebody who is not intensively managing it, but managing their land effectively for timber values? Do you see that as being all of those values holding the same weight, or is there a greater incentive, or should there be a greater incentive for somebody not to be managing their land like as a forest woodland?
I think that's actually one of the $1 million questions, because it is quite a fine line. I think, in my research of Europe and the US, there is that kind of concern of, conservation land that isn't managed for timber, that you're disturbing as little as possible. While, some people that may have, like what Peter Schleifenbaum had, a forest that had many deformed and diseased trees. So I think it really is dependent on the situation of the forest. And I think it depends on how actively the landowner wants to be involved in the management of the property. It is a lot to take on. And for some people that don't know a lot about forests and their management, it may just be easier for them to say, I just want to enjoy the beauty of my property and look at the wildlife as it passes through and give it to the Nature Conservancy, while others may like the idea of benefiting financially from it with either firewood, like I know some families up near Haliburton, the Nesbitts, who actually help with Haliburton forest operations, or other people that want to have a sugar maple bush. So I think it really is dependent on the situation and the property itself, because size matters as well. If it's a smaller property, it might be easier to manage with a sort of laissez-faire, like we'll just kind of leave it to it is, especially if it is a healthy forest. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and lastly, I just had a question, a little bit here. Would you apply the same tax regime in terms of incentives to large corporations that own hundreds of thousands of hectares of land, and in comparison to those persons who would have, say, I have my family woodlot of 100 acres. So the big corporation and the little 100 acre or hectare woodlot owner, would you apply the same taxation regime to both?
No, but I do know that like some crown management units that are operated by, private companies do have their own sort of fund or their sort of access to like financial resources. So I think this incentive is really targeted to those smaller properties where, it's hard because it's one individual or one family. And so I don't think it would apply the same way. There might be a sort of similar benefit, perhaps, if, especially in terms of if they're practicing sustainable forest management and they're conserving certain values. But I think this sort of tax program really is geared towards smaller properties and like family owned or, single person owned properties.
Okay, thank you. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. Interesting questions. Malcolm, do you have any contributions there?
I do. Thank you. Thanks, Sanda. Congratulations on getting through the presentation. Two questions, or at least two questions. One's that you touched on the tactics that were employed by Peter Schleifenbaum and more broadly by Haliburton Forest back in the day to try to have the tax regime assess specifically the closing of snowmobile trails and some of the lobbying that went on there too. In your view, like, since you've got a fairly deep perspective into the historical context of what went on at that time, do you think the ends justified the means? And if not, how far should a landowner be prepared to go when a tax regime is perceived as unfair to their ownership objectives?
Yeah, that's a really great point. I know there was a lot of frustrations from some members of the public about the closures. And I think, I had to skip over, the letters upon letters that were sent, the meetings that were had that led to no resolutions. And I think it was just one of those things where this was the sort of last straw. And this was that kind of last big push to really get recognition for the issue. And I think because it was a sort of collaborative effort and it affected, the snowmobile and cross-country trails, I think, getting the public on board did justify the means. They were also very flexible in speaking to the snowmobilers clubs and the cross-country clubs, and they were, very understanding about the impacts that it would have on the tourism industry. So I think in the end, it was justified, yes.
Good. No, it's a good answer. I mean, those particular actions remain the stuff of legend up here, as I'm sure you observed in your time in Haliburton. My other question is, and again, because you're one of the few people that's kind of taken the long view of the history of these programs, starting with Public Land Act in the mid 1800s, and then you've got the Private Woodland Program and Woodland Improvement Act and so on, all the way up to MFTIP. Every day that goes by, the trees keep growing. And no matter who owns these properties, they're going to keep doing their thing, and this land will out-exist everybody watching your presentation today. If we look forward to the year 2121, 100 years from now, what kind of property tax program do you think will be in place?
That's a really good question. Let me take a moment just to think on that. I think going through the history and seeing the influence of different governments and, different mentalities about environmentalism and the kind of growing perspective that we have about forests and their importance on, the global climate. I think that, these sort of tax incentive programs, I don't know specifically what they would have, but I think that they would be geared towards this sort of longevity and the idea that, if you are contributing positively to the maintenance of these forests, that you will be rewarded. And I think it really comes down to the fact that a lot of these property owners, they do have to think about the trees 100 years from now, which, is how long it takes for a sugar maple to grow. So I think there will be tax programs, and I think it will hopefully also start to value the non-timber aspects of forests and how they contribute to the surrounding areas, given that these ecosystem services don't stop at just the fiber and the timber, but also the trail access, wildlife habitat, soil erosion prevention, as well as water quality.
Okay, good. Congratulations, Sanda. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thomas, I see that you have a question. Would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, actually, Malcolm just got some HF representation, and I'll happily lead to Jay and John, but please come back to me if we have time.
All right, thanks very much. Jay, quick question?
No, I'm going to defer to John because my question's basically already been answered too.
Okay, John.
Yeah, I recently had a friend who bought some property, and I told him about this program, and he checked it out, and he actually ended up joining it. And he's asked me later, he said, why doesn't everybody do this? And so I'm curious, what are the kind of main barriers to more people getting involved?
Well, I know my parents actually have a property which is only a ½ acre. So I think it just depends on the size of your property. Does it qualify for MFTIP, which does require, still a substantial amount of land? And then I think it's just a matter of knowing about the program. A lot of people that, maybe have moved from the cities to rural areas don't really know that there's these sort of beneficial programs, or, don't know that they can do anything. So I think that's a major part of it. And then also I think they, might feel overwhelmed because they think that, oh, now I have to create a management plan. I have to actually go out there and, chop some wood and actually like look at my trees. So I think it comes down to knowing how much of a responsibility you have while you're in this program, as well as, other factors in order to be eligible to join.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation.